We all possess hidden truths, yet some truths are shrouded in deeper shadows. Hugo Boss stands as a fashion label intertwined with affluence, sophistication, and prestige, donned by numerous notable figures. However, beneath the veneer of this fashion titan lies a concealed history, one that involves support for Hitler, the production of uniforms for the Nazis, and a remarkable transformation that allowed the brand to rebrand and flourish on a global scale. Hugo Boss was born in Germany in 1885, in a town known for its textile industry. In fact, Hugo's parents owned a modest lingerie shop, and thus Hugo himself developed an interest in fashion from an early age. As a teen, he took jobs that would help him understand the ins and outs of the industry. He initially began an apprenticeship as a merchant, then worked in a textile mill. However, soon after World War I broke out, Hugo took the opportunity to serve his country. And whilst Hugo survived the war, he returned with a new vision of what he wanted to do with his life. Rather than running his parents' small shop, he wanted to create his own fashion company. And thus he transformed the shop into a tailor's that he named after himself. Since Hugo had been gaining experience from such a young age, it only took him a couple of years before he was able to turn his shop into a whole factory. And before long, the company's clothing became fairly well known around Germany. However, one of the consequences of World War I was that Germany had been ordered to pay the winning countries a huge amount of money in reparations. The debt was set at 132 billion gold marks, the equivalent of about 270 billion US dollars in today's currency. This began to cripple the German economy and set the stage for an extremely tough and grueling era, as the US, UK, and France enjoyed extravagant spending on behalf of Germany's debt, a time known in America as the Roaring Twenties. Germany struggled to pay off the war while having enough to support their own country. As a result, German citizens saw high inflation and business closures. And therefore, even though Hugo Boss clothing had been pretty popular, his company began to suffer. No amount of good reputation could help the fact people were struggling to afford his work. Germany was in a desperate situation, and they were willing to seek help from anyone. It was during this time that Adolf Hitler rose to power. But for Hugo Boss, he saw this as an opportunity. He knew that those close to the Nazi Party were eligible for government contracts, and thus he became a proud supporter of the Nazis, and an active member of the Nazi Party from 1931 onward. He managed to build connections with them and eventually won a contract to begin producing their uniforms. So, with only 6 sewing machines, Hugo got to work. And at first, this was just making the Nazi uniforms. For example, one of his first big contracts was to supply brown shirts to the Nazis. But as the party grew into power, they required more uniforms. For example, for soldiers, the police, and the Hitler Youth. Hugo Boss' allegiance to Hitler paid off massively. He was making way more money than his business ever had before. And as Hitler began his conquest of Europe, Hugo Boss was soon given help through the use of French and Polish forced laborers. So Hugo Boss had slave laborers working in his factory, producing uniforms for the Nazi Party and the SS. Thankfully though, when the war finally ended and the Nazis were defeated, Hugo Boss was investigated. And because Hugo Boss was found to be an activist and financial beneficiary of the Nazi Party, he was banned from owning a business. Just a couple of years later, in 1948, Hugo Boss died. And so you would think the company bearing his name would die along with him. But of course, we all know that's not the case. In present day, Hugo Boss is a multi-billion-dollar clothing empire. So what happened? After Hugo Boss' death, what very little was left of the company went to his son-in-law Eugen Holy, who kept the business going by producing uniforms for the police and postal workers. Although the sale of uniforms kept the business afloat, the Hugo Boss brand became a shell of its former self, as of course, they no longer had those lucrative Nazi contracts. It wasn't until the early 1950s that the Hugo Boss company was tasked with producing an order of suits. This was the major turning point for the business. The suits they created seemed very popular, and Eugen realized there could be an opportunity here to rebrand the company, so he began taking more suit orders. And to try and build a good reputation, Eugen ensured the suits were elegant and made with very high-quality materials. Although this was expensive, Hugen's decision to make high-profile suits paid off because the Hugo Boss brand moved from just being a uniform brand to a true German fashion tailor, and thus, Hugo Boss quickly became a popular brand for men in Germany wanting stylish suits. Under the management of Hugo's son-in-law, Hugo Boss became a bigger business than it had been back when the original founders Hugo had been running it as a tailoring business. But it was a constant ongoing battle to try and distance themselves from their founder and how much money he'd made from supporting Hitler. However, in 1969, Hugen retired and handed the business off to his two sons, meaning the company was now into its third generation of ownership. And these two brothers were even more ambitious than their father. They were determined to make the company into a global fashion icon. The two brothers who took over the company from their father started marketing Hugo Boss as a men's-only designer brand, specifically focused on premium suits. Whilst selling such a small variety of clothing might seem like a limitation, it actually allowed them to focus on the quality of their products and become great at men's suits, rather just being average at lots of different things. As a result, their products quickly got a very good reputation. You see, at the time, German suits tended to be made with only German materials, which were known to be a little stiff and heavy. Whereas the two brothers decided to break the German tradition and began making suits with Italian materials that were softer and lighter. They also modernized their factories and hired more workers to increase their output. The changes made by the two brothers fulfilled their father's dream of Hugo Boss. The brothers also did something that was uncommon at the time, which was manufacturing abroad. Today, that practice is used by nearly every big business. But for a proud German company to outsource its production was relatively unheard of at the time. Not just that, but since the company had now deviated so much from its original starting point of making uniforms and fairly low-cost workwear, the brothers felt they needed a rebrand, and thus began marketing the brand simply as Boss. And everything seemed to be going great for the company under the ownership of these two brothers. Their suits were selling really well in Germany, and so the brothers decided it was time to expand even further. They wanted to go global and start selling in countries all over the world. But they knew to become a world-recognized fashion house, they needed to invest heavily in marketing. A good decision the brothers made was to spend heavily on endorsement deals, where they'd have the Boss branding plastered on race cars used by the era's greatest drivers. This immediately helped them become more recognizable outside Germany, and it led to the first Boss suit being sold in the United States in 1976. They also paid big money to get endorsement deals from some of the biggest stars of the time. For example, they got Sylvester Stallone to model their suits and become the poster boy for the Boss brand, and their timing was pretty perfect. Because in the 1980s, the yuppie movement began, where more and more people were aspiring to be CEOs, entrepreneurs, and having a stylish suit was a classic part of that look. With the premium materials and the extensive ad campaigns and endorsement deals, Boss suits became heavily in demand. And so, even though they focused primarily on just men's suits to begin with, this alone was extremely profitable. In 1985, they began offering their male customers a lot more. Like they came up with the idea to sell their own fragrances, beginning with the Boss No. 1 for men. This single cologne would be one of Boss' most profitable products. However, despite the brothers achieving so much success with the company, they were also exhausted and wanted to focus on something different after devoting so much of their time to this business. So in 1989, they sold the majority of their shares to a Japanese company named Leighton House Group. Following the 90s economic downturn, Hugo Boss adapted, splitting into 3 brands to cater to different demographics and affordability levels. They ventured into women's fashion, diversified their product range, and collaborated with the film industry, solidifying their global success. In recent years, Hugo Boss faced negative publicity, notably when comedian Joe Lycett legally changed his name to protest the brand's aggressive trademark enforcement against small businesses using the word boss. This controversy highlighted the company's treatment of smaller enterprises, even ones unrelated to fashion, and led to a viral backlash against the brand. Hugo Boss transformed over time, weathering storms and adapting to fashion's changing tides. Learned from stumbles, they strive to stay modern and make their mark in the fashion world. It's a journey of evolution and resilience.